Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 436. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot of news to talk about on the Ukraine war today, so I want to get into it pretty quickly here. Again, this week we will have an abbreviated show scheduled. Both myself and Connor Freeman are in PorkFest in New Hampshire for PorkFest this week. So, if you are at PorkFest, Connor is speaking on Tuesday. I am speaking on Thursday at 2 p.m. After Thursday, I'm going to be hanging out at PorkFest for the rest of the weekend. So at any time, come on over to the Libertarian Institute area, say hello, and be really happy to talk to some people and really looking forward to it. So hope to see a bunch of you at PorkFest. Hopefully some of you will show up to my talk on Thursday. And just a reminder, you can follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. You find the show at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version, and it's up everywhere you can listen to podcasts. Let's get into the show today. All right, so this first article here isn't my, kind of typical beat that I write up. It's not necessarily a war issue, but it's mass surveillance. I found this report from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and I didn't see it gain a lot of coverage, although after I wrote this article, I did see several other mainstream outlets picked it up and some independent libertarian outlets did as well. But this article titled U.S. Intelligence Community Buying Swaths of Commercial Data Replicating Mass Surveillance Program. And so I think there's a lot of really important information in this report. All right. A report released by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, that's the ODNI, on Friday, this is, I think, probably 2 weeks ago now, is purchasing massive amounts of commercially available data, which they call CAI, that can reveal sensitive and intimate information about individuals. CAI is data that is available for purchase, often from non-government entities, and is typically labeled as anonymous. However, the ODNI report dated January 2022. It was only released in June of 2023, so it's about a year and a half old, but this is when the report was put out. There are a lot of redactions in the report. It says, although CAI may be autonomous, it is often possible using other CAI to just identify individuals, including U.S. persons. The CAI poses a significant threat to Americans as it, and this is a quote from the report, can be misused to pry into private lives, ruin reputations, and cause emotional distress and threaten the safety of individuals. Even subject to appropriate control, CAI can increase the power of government's ability to peer into our private lives to levels that may exceed our constitutional traditions and other social expectations. Now, when I wrote this up, I did see a couple comments on Twitter saying, oh, private companies could do this too. Yes, and that is a problem. We should be very aware of what is happening with our data and with the amount of data that most of us have online, probably myself included. People could learn a lot of information about us by buying even anonymous data. So keep that in mind as you use the internet, that all this exists. But I think the biggest threat that if a company it uses this for target advertising, that's not great, right? But that isn't the same thing as the government using it to put people in jail, particularly people who shouldn't be, or to leak information and ruin people's lives. Also, I guess a private company could do that, and that's something worry about as well. Okay, so back to the article here. As such information has become more available, intelligence agencies have been vacuuming out vast amounts of data. While ODNI does not reveal the full scope of the information purchased, it names several companies including CareLogic, Epsilon, Intelligence, LexisNexis, Oracle, and Thomson Reuters as major contractors working with the U.S. government. Senator Ron Wyden said the ODNI did not know which agencies were purchasing CAI. The ODNI report called for the intelligence community to develop a multi-layered approach to catalog to the extent feasible the acquisition and use of CAI across its 18 elements. And so this is kind of presented in the report as a monitor or a controlling system, when in reality, I think it would be far more dangerous if, purchasing CAI from multiple vendors allows for, that data to become easier to identify the individuals, even if that data is anonymous. Then it would seem that the more CAI that you have collected, and so let's say the NSA, the FBI, the CIA, and all these other agencies all have their own little pockets of CAA right now. While it may be a waste of money and kind of inefficient, I think our our alphabet soup agencies being inefficient and not using the best abilities is probably good for the rest of us. And again, this particular report we're quoting here is 16 months old, so who knows exactly what has been developed over that time. The Wall Street Journal described the large swaths of data collected as equally intrusive as the government's existing mass surveillance programs under agencies like the NSA. The outlet explains, CAI has grown in such a scale that it has begun to replicate the results of intrusive surveillance techniques once used on a more targeted and limited basis. Federal agencies have increasingly turned to CAI because it is less regulated than other forms of collection. The ODNI report admits that stricter rules for data harvesting should be used, as CAI can be as sensitive information collected through a search warrant. And this is from the report. CAI includes information on nearly everyone that is of a type and of a level of sensitivity that historically could have been attained, if at all, only through target and predicted collection. The report found, adding, and some could be used to cause harm to an individual's reputation, emotional well-being, and physical safety. Senator Ron Wyden said the collection of CAI violates the U.S. Constitution, stating, if the U.S. government can buy its ways around the Fourth Amendment due process, there will be few meaningful limits on government surveillance. And, Ron Wyden's a Democrat, and he has a lot of flaws, but he has always been good on surveillance on the Snowden stuff. So hopefully he continues to speak out and push this issue, because I do think he's right. Essentially what we have here is the government buying their way around the Fourth Amendment. I mean, they're taking our tax dollars, they're giving it to these companies, and then they're using that to spy on us with almost no oversight or regulation or awareness from the American public at all. This article I wrote last Monday for the Libertarian Institute. I think it's pretty important, even though the kind of what's going to happen here is unlikely. What the U.S. is proposing is unlikely, but the fact that they're proposing it at all is significant. So let's get into this. The White House is developing plans to expand the number of permanent members to the United Nations Security Council, the UNSC, the Washington Post reported on Monday. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, is spearheading the effort to enlarge the body by adding 6 new members. The UNSC is the organization's most powerful body, wielding the power to impose binding resolutions. Known collectively as the P5, the US, UK, France, China, and Russia are currently the permanent members on the council, which include a total of 10 rotating members. So you have the UN Security Council. It's always the US, UK, France, China, Russia. There's 15 members, but the other members really don't have a lot of power, because what is meaningful in the Security Council is to be able to veto, and only the 5 permanent members to do that. In September, President Joe Biden said the body should be expanded to include countries from Latin America and Africa. Under the proposal the Biden administration is developing, 6 new permanent members will be added to the UNSC. The White House has not put forward its plan, leaving it unclear what countries may be added to the council. Washington has previously advocated for Germany and Japan and India to respond on the UNSC. However, under the Biden administration plan, the new members will not have veto power held by the core 5 members. The UNSC rules allow for any of the 5 permanent members to kill any resolution unilaterally. Ukraine has called for Moscow to be removed from the UN Security Council, citing its ongoing invasion. This was an op-ed published by the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba in The Hill. It said, Russia has turned the seat of permanent member into a throne of impunity. Russia never legally acquired its status as a permanent UN Security Council member and must lose its seat in the esteemed chamber. Reforming the UNSC is expected to meet stiff resistance. An unnamed American official told the Post that Thomas Greenfield is trying to forge some consensus on a sensible, credible proposal that could actually succeed and achieve reform. Barbara Woodward, the UK ambassador to the UN, argued that the proposed changes could be used against Russia. We must respond to Russia's egregious actions, use of veto to protect itself, and update the Council's membership to give a wider, more diverse range of countries a voice, she said. Some officials believe that such reforms could damage Western power. And this is something that an unnamed diplomat told the Post. Any reform of the UN Security Council may well reduce the weight of the West, so this is a reality. And the question is, are we really pushing for that now? Is this just nice rhetoric that we want to do this, or are we really serious when we say we want to do that now? The proposal is also likely to face opposition from states whose rivals may become a permanent member of the council, risking major regional power shifts. For example, Pakistan objects to the expansion, anticipating that longtime adversary India will get a seat. This is undemocratic. It is unequal. It is contrary to the principle of the sovereign equality of states, which is a part of the UN Charter, said Islamabad's UN ambassador. Any change to the UNSC would require clearing a lot of hurdles, including approval from 128 states in the UN General Assembly, as well as sitting UN Security Council members. For the U.S., that means ratification by the Senate. And so you could probably imagine that from the position of Beijing, they're not going to be too interested in India joining the UN Security Council as a permanent member. They're certainly not going to be interested in the U.S. adding Germany and Japan as well, because this would increase, the power of the West. And so what they're saying, I think, reading between the lines of that unnamed diplomat, is if you look at what would likely happen, India isn't firmly aligned with the West, even though it does have, historic and border territorial issues with China. A country like Brazil or South Africa, Indonesia, all these very large countries, very large economies, they have a lot of influence, at least among the global South, could be potential countries that could be added to the UN Security Council. However, I think from Washington's perspective, they're going to see it as losing power in the UNSC. So they're probably going to be pretty unlikely to agree to anything that Russia and China would also agree to. Passing the legislature seems unlikely as a group of Republican senators oppose Russia remaining on the UNSC. After Russia invaded Ukraine last year, a large group of Republican senators introduced a resolution urging the Biden administration to remove Moscow from the body. And this is Senator Kevin Cramer, a Republican from North Dakota. It's high time to remove Russia from the UNSC, if for no other reason than the unwarranted violent invasion of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin's thuggery and aggression should have consequences on every level. The Kremlin has vetoed a series of measures brought before the UNSC that condemn the Russian war in Ukraine. Washington has previously used the body to pass measures as cover for wars in Libya, Syria, and Yemen. All right, let's move on now and get into the war in Ukraine. So I don't think that UN thing is going to happen, but I do think the U.S. is probably going to upset some countries by merely floating the proposal like they seem to be doing with Pakistan already. All right, first article up here on Ukraine. I wrote for antiwarga.com on June 16th. Zelensky slams Trump for saying he would end the war in Ukraine. In an interview with NBC News, Ukrainian President Zelensky attacked former President Donald Trump's pledge to end the war. He argued that if Kiev does not defeat Moscow, Russia will attack a NATO member state and force the U.S. into direct conflict. Zelensky was asked about Trump's claim that he would immediately engage the Kremlin in talks and bring the war to a negotiated settlement. Zelensky said, "Are they ready to start a war to send their children? Are they ready to die? If Russia occupies Ukraine, they will move on to the Baltic countries, to Poland, to any NATO country, and in that particular case, the U.S. will have to choose between dismantling NATO or fighting." Kiev and Hawks in Washington have been asserting that Ukraine is a bulwark, protecting members of NATO from Moscow's expansionist ambitions. However, There is no evidence that the Kremlin is attacking another country. Russian President Vladimir Putin views Ukraine as a unique security threat to his country and says seizing territory protects Moscow against the expanding NATO alliance. Ukraine hopes to be added to a member of the alliance once the war is over. Zelensky said, "We need an invitation, and it needs to be clear that after this war, if we are ready and Ukraine army is ready to NATO standards, then after the war we will be invited to join. It is very important to hear the truth and not to tell us lies." I'll get to more on Ukraine's NATO ship later in the episode. I got an article from David Camp on that, but I just want to kind of continue here with Trump versus the Zelensky angle. So in 2008, Ukraine was told it would one day receive full NATO membership. At the time, Moscow denounced the proposal, saying it violated red lines from the Russian perspective and would create a significant security threat. Despite the Russian objections, NATO maintains its doors are open to new members, but Ukraine currently does not meet the requirements. As Kiev is currently at war with Moscow, admitting Ukraine into the alliance would put NATO into direct confrontation with Russia. At times, Kiev appears to be frustrated with NATO refusing to make a formal commitment to Ukraine. Zelensky is threatening to sit out the upcoming NATO meeting of the North Atlantic Alliance in July because Ukraine would not receive a pledge to become a member once the war is over. Zelensky then went on to slam Trump, claiming he would be able to end the war in Ukraine because he was unable to while he was in office. Why didn't he do it earlier? He was president when the war was going on here, he explained. I think he couldn't do that. I think there are no people today in the world who could just have a word with Putin and end the war. And so I thought that was extremely interesting, that statement from Zelensky there, because I really think it cuts against the idea that this war is unprovoked. He's admitting that this war was going on back at least in 2020. And of course, what he's referring to is the civil war that broke out in Ukraine after the U.S. coup in 2014, when the Donbass region, sought more autonomy and independence, and the Ukrainian government launched what it called a war of terrorism against the people of that region. Those people are, backed by Russia, the Donbass and Luhansk armies, but at the same time, there were agreements negotiated called the Minsk Accords that were supposed to bring that fighting to an end. However, Zelensky was never able to get the Ukrainian forces to implement that agreement. And one of the reasons I phrase it like that is there's this video where you see Zelensky going and talking to some of these commanders of the frontline fighters and telling them that we're going to try to enforce the Minsk Accords, and they laugh at him and tell him, no, we're going to keep fighting because, the people on the front lines of this war have been extremists. All right, Israel monitoring the black market arms smuggling from Ukraine. I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute on June 15th. The Israeli Defense Forces are monitoring arms smuggling out of Ukraine and weapons captured by Russia over fears they could be used by Iran. A recent Pentagon report found insufficient tracking of weapons shipped to Ukraine via Poland, and we broke this down on the show last week. I wrote that article. So the source for this is a senior IDF commander speaking with Newsweek, and while we are skeptical on this show about claims from the IDF and from unnamed officials, I think the important thing here is Israel works really hard, especially as they are cracking down on their own Palestinians, to not upset the U.S. too much. They've capitulated to, some extent at this point on, how much they're willing to give the U.S. support for Ukraine. So I'm kind of surprised that the IDF is going to come out with this publicly unless they are really concerned about it. So I do think this report has a good amount of credibility. So the senior IDF commander explained, it's really challenging to build a picture, but we see signs. We see signs, and this is very, very troubling. The IDF official said there was a smuggling route from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. The unnamed source explained the weapons, including Javelin anti-tank missiles, were placed on the black market by Ukrainian paramilitary forces for financial reasons. The IDF is concerned for other reasons, about weapons making their way to Iran, and this includes Russia capturing Western-made weapons on the battlefield. The commander believes once the weapons make their way to Tehran, the Islamic Republic will reverse engineer them and then put them in the hands of Hamas and Hezbollah. The intelligence official, this is not the same IDF official. This is a different intelligence official that was speaking to Newsweek, said that Russia has shipped Javelin anti-tank systems to Iran last year. The source reportedly said the systems were verified that they were in Iran by satellite imagery, although Newsweek admits that they were unable to confirm via the satellite imagery that actually happened. The State Department says it's taking steps to prevent weapons from ending up on the black market. But this is, I think, largely just propaganda from the U.S. When we look at the actual reports like the one I wrote up last week from the Department of Defense Inspector General, there's not a close monitoring system for even weapons getting to Ukraine. And once they get into Ukraine, I'm guessing the situation gets even more foggy and harder to tell where the weapons are going. So some of the failures outlined in the DoD IG report include American forces stationed in Poland were found to lack proper training and create their own systems for monitoring arms that flew into Ukraine. These systems were put in place by the troops that were in Poland before the current ones, rotated in, and they had a system. So this, group adopted that system and then add some of their own flavor to it. And that's essentially how the accounting system is going. Additionally, many weapon systems were shipped without flight manifest. And so this creates problems because the troops on the ground are clueless as to how much gear should have been in the shipment, even if they are able to determine how much gear is actually there. Now, despite the DOD IG report, the State Department spokesperson told Newsweek that Russia continues to push disinformation alleging illicit arms diversion by Ukraine. And so they just kind of chalk it all up to anti-Russia propaganda, which is clearly not the case. The director of the Brussels-based Flemish Peace Institute and coordinator of the European Commission-funded project Insight said that the weapon smuggling began in the war's early days. He said, during each armed conflict, weapons are diverted, especially small arms and light weapons. This is also the case in Ukraine, where weapons have ended up in civilian hands already in the first days of the conflict. The Israeli official said the IDF was struggling to determine the scope of the black market arms trade, but noted that weapons were flowing to North Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. And we already know that some of these weapons have ended up in Finland and Nigeria. All right, so the counteroffensive is still ongoing, and from what I could see, there's really no significant changes in the battle lines. There are villages changing hands. There are different positions changing hands, but this is expected during any piece of intense fighting. So this comment from General Milley is very important. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, predicted Thursday that Ukraine's counteroffensive would be very long and very violent, and this falls on media and military officials in Brussels. And we've heard this from other officials too. The French President Macron said that, he expected the counteroffensive could take weeks or months. I'm not sure if that's actually the case, if that's maybe a bluff by Western officials. And I'm sure there's some strategy and tactical reasons to do it, right? Russia is paying attention to what General Milley says. And so if they feel like they could deceive the Kremlin in some way by helping to shade Ukraine's hand, that made some sense. At the same time, if you look at the kind of availability of troops that Ukraine has, there's a really good article by Douglas McGregor in the American Conservative where he breaks this down. I'm really not sure how long that the Ukrainians could keep up this counteroffensive, especially if they're taking the kinds of losses that they do seem to be taking. So, it's just a good idea to keep an open mind here. We did see that was last fall that Ukraine did have, I would say, several days, if not a full week, of unsuccessful operations before they finally start to make some territory in their counteroffensives. I do think this time is different, but it's just a good thing to keep an eye on. All right, next up here, Putin shows African leaders draft treaty on Ukrainian neutrality from March 22. So this is Putin had a meeting with African leaders in St. Petersburg, and this was around, the African delegation trying to bring the war to an end. And apparently he said, as you know, a string of talks between Russia and Ukraine took place in Turkey so as to work out both the confidence building measures you mentioned and to draw up the text of the agreement. We did not discuss with Ukraine, the Ukrainian side, that this treaty will be classified, but we have never presented it nor commented on it. This draft agreement was initiated by the head of Kiev's negotiation team. He put his signature on it there. Here it is. Now, do I know if this document is authentic or not? No. Is this just another piece of evidence that there was an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, including evidence coming from Western sources that there was this agreement in place? Yeah. So it seems very likely to me that this is probably somewhat along the lines of true. I don't know, maybe Russia had a verbal agreement and typed up the document and forged the signature or something like that. But if we look at what the Turkish foreign minister was saying at the time, what the Israeli prime minister at the time was saying, what Fiona Hill has said, who have all basically confirmed that there was an agreement that would lead to Ukrainian neutrality in place in March of last year, this agreement falls right in line with that. And so it wouldn't surprise me if it was correct. I'm not sure what the African leaders are going to necessarily say or feel about it, and we'll see how this goes further. It's important to remember, too, that it was the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson who's alleged to have killed the agreement by going to Kiev and telling Zelensky not to sign it. Another just kind of interesting note is that there were assassinations of the Ukrainian negotiating team around the time, so you wonder if that has something to do with it. All right, so here we are on Ukraine's potential for becoming either getting a guaranteed pathway to NATO or becoming a NATO state at this upcoming summit. Biden says he won't make it easy for Ukraine to join NATO. President Biden said Saturday that he won't make it easy for Ukraine to join NATO as the alliance is debating what new commitments to extend to Kiev at an upcoming summit in Lithuania that will be held from July 11th to 12th. Most NATO members agree that Ukraine can't be offered full NATO membership while it's fighting a war with Russia. Some countries want to promise Kiev that it will become a member after the war, but the U.S. is said to be resisting this idea. And I think we've covered this kind of debate fairly extensively on the show. It's the Eastern European countries versus the U.S. and some of the Western European countries who are far more resistant to extending this promise to Ukraine. I talked about this on Crosstalk, which is an RT show program last week. The host was absolutely great. The panel was great. One of the things that kind of came up was how this is going to, if NATO promises Ukraine that it's going to become a member of the alliance after the war ends, that's going to create a real problem for Russia bringing the war to an end. Because if the negotiations lead to Ukraine becoming a NATO member, then that crosses the Russian red line. So this would seem to be something that probably prolongs the war. At the same time, from Kiev's perspective, maybe they're holding out for this, trying to get the membership because they see it as the only way they could possibly end the war, because they would get NATO membership on the other side. But I think that's probably one of the reasons why the Western countries, Washington, don't really want to give Ukraine the guarantee either, is because it might incentivize Kiev to jump into negotiations. Although, again, I don't think those negotiations would bear any fruit. So the U.S. still expects Sweden to join NATO this July, despite Erdogan's comments. Erdogan is the leader of Turkey, and he has said that Sweden will not become a NATO member, get Turkey's approval by July. I think Hungary still has to give approval too, although, as I've speculated, and I'm pretty sure I'm right about, it's the same situation with Finland, where Hungary doesn't want to be the last state to approve a new member joining NATO. They also don't want to do it if they don't have to. And so if Turkey is going to hold out, then Hungary is going to hold out. If Turkey is going to do it, then Hungary is going to do it. I really personally have no idea how this is going to go. If they're going to end up, I do think Sweden is going to end up in NATO. It's just a matter of time. I do think it's still going to be a little bit of time, but I could be wrong about that. All right, here, last up, this U.S. deploys F-22s to Middle East to confront Russian aircraft over Syria. Washington has sent F-22 Raptor fighter jets to the Middle East in a show of force, eyeing Moscow, claiming Russian aircraft have been aggressively behaving in the skies above Syria in recent months. The Kremlin has similarly accused U.S. warplanes of targeting Russian aircraft in eastern Syria. Now, this has been going on for 8 years or so, the U.S. and Russian aircraft having issues over the skies of Syria. I mean, at one point in time, Turkey shot down a Russian aircraft, which, wild that we got past that movement. And now Turkish-Russian relations are far better than U.S.-Russian relations. But we now have, CENTCOM saying they're sending these F-22s and the Russians are behaving badly. The Russians say that the U.S. planes are targeting Russian aircraft above Syria when they're trying to target the Islamic State fighters and others, helping Assad to win that war. Now, I think the biggest problem here is this, really represents how committed the Biden administration is to continuing to fight the regime change war in Syria and, willing to confront Russia over it. And, even though the U.S. and Russia have managed to kind of share this airspace between their militaries for the past several years, obviously as relations between Russia and the West have taken a downturn, this is probably hurting the ability for Russia and the U.S. to talk even over other issues like Syria, use those deconfliction lines and things like that. So this seems really problematic, and I will definitely be keeping an eye on it. Again, everybody, thank you for tuning into the show today. One more show this week, and then I'm at Portfest. See y'all.